What's up y'all, welcome back to Fish of the Moment. In this video, I'm going to break down Dustin Connell's winning pattern at the Major League Fishing Redcrest event on Lake Eufaula. I'll be talking about his baits, areas, the electronics he was using, and I'm actually going to go out in the water as well and show you how I replicated his pattern and break it down in as much detail as possible. Let's get into it. Here's a graphic of some of the key factors that allowed Dustin Connell to take home the $300,000 payday at Redcrest. Let's start by talking about the lake. Lake Eufaula in Alabama is a lowland reservoir. The average water visibility is between 1 and 3 feet. On the upper end of the lake, you have the shallow river section. A lot of guys were catching fish, flipping and throwing chatterbaits in the backwaters in this area. The midsection of the lake has a little bit clearer water and offers both shallow and offshore fishing opportunities. However, Dustin Connell caught his fish on the lower end of the lake. This is where you have the clearest water and there's a lot of good offshore structure. Dustin wasn't fishing that far offshore and instead focused on shallower offshore areas that held staging pre-spawn bass. There are a lot of factors that made the offshore bite the best strategy in this tournament. Before this tournament, there was a major cold front across the entire country and water temperatures dropped into the high 40s. However, as the tournament unfolded, the water temperatures rose to the upper 50s and lower 60s. Despite the warmer water temperatures, the bass didn't make a big move into the shallow water areas due to the fluctuating water level. At the beginning of the tournament, the water levels were high enough to offer a lot of good shallow water cover to the anglers. However, the water temperatures weren't warm enough to get a big wave of bass to move into that shallow cover. Then, as the tournament progressed, the water temperatures rose, but the water level began to drop. This dropping water level kept a lot of fish from moving up into the shallower, warming water. Then, during the final days of the tournament, the water level began to fluctuate. It would rise one day and fall the next day. Whenever you have this fluctuating water level right around the spawn, the bass become uneasy about actually laying their eggs because they are not sure if the water level is going to drop a foot the next day and leave their eggs high and dry. This caused the bass to stay a little bit further off the bank, even though water temperatures were approaching the 61 to 62 degree range. This 6 to 8 foot of water is where Dustin Connell caught the majority of his fish and was able to take the victory. The primary cover in that 6 to 8 foot range on Lake Eufaula are man-made brush piles. These are basically trees that are dropped by other anglers in the middle of the lake. Dustin found a series of brush piles during practice using his side imaging. He then regraphed them with his down imaging to determine which brush piles had fish in them. Here's an example of what one of these brush piles probably looked like. You can see the bass right here in the center of the screen. Now it's important to note that not every single brush pile on Lake Eufaula was holding bass. Dustin mentioned that the brush piles he was fishing were, quote, connected to the bank. What does this mean? Well, basically it means that there's a piece of structure that's connecting the brush pile to the shoreline. Here's an example from Lake Eufaula. Here we have an offshore point that sticks out in the middle of the lake. The point is highlighted in red, and then the blue area is deeper water. The brush pile that Dustin was fishing would be positioned somewhere around here in 6 to 8 feet of water. This brush pile is connected to the bank by that shallow point that sticks off the bank. This is the perfect area to find pre-spawn bass under the conditions the anglers were fishing. The bass want to spawn up on the shoreline, however the fluctuating water levels are causing them to stay further off the bank. They don't want to be in super deep water, but they want to be in just deep enough water where they can continue to feed up for the spawn. This brush pile in 6 to 8 feet of water that's connected to the shoreline by that point allows them a quick, easy access to the shoreline whenever they want to spawn and is a great place for them to stage while they're waiting. To catch these fish, Dustin was using a variety of deep diving jerkbaits. The jerkbait was a really interesting tool to use around brush piles. You would expect that the hooks would get hung up in the brush. However, by combining the jerkbait with his X factor in this tournament, the new Lowrance active target, he was able to actually watch the fish follow his jerkbaits out of the brush pile, stop the jerkbait and cause it to suspend, and then twitch the bait in front of the fish's face using a variety of different cadences to trigger the bite. This is a pretty complicated technique to explain, so I went out to the lake and tried to replicate Dustin's pattern to show you exactly what these fish look like on forward-facing sonar, as well as different retrieves you can use to trigger these fish. Got him. There we go. Good one right there. Watch him eat that thing on the live scope. Nice one right off the bat here. That's what I was talking about. Jerkbait over the top of a brush pile on the live scope. That is a tank, guys. Oh, there we go. That's what I'm talking about, guys. Got that fish on the jerkbait Megabass Vision 110 out of a brush pile, just like we're talking about with Dustin Connell. Beautiful fish right there. That's what I'm talking about. Oh, beautiful fish right there, guys, on the jerkbait out of a brush pile, just like Dustin Connell was catching them on Lake Eufaula during that Major League Fishing Tour event. Beautiful fish right there. In this video, we're gonna break down exactly how to catch these fish, the locations, the baits, everything like that. Let's get this fish back in the lake though, so we can get back and put a few more fish in the boat. Woo! There we go, guys. Let's get this fish back down in the lake. That's what I'm talking about. Get back down there, fish. And she's off. There we go. Let's get another one. Let's take a closer look at the area where I just caught that fish. This is a spawning pocket where the bass will eventually lay their eggs in shallow water. This pocket's pretty unique because it has very flat sides and then drops sharply into a creek channel, forming a ditch or a drain. In the center of that ditch, there's a large brush pile in 6 to 8 feet of water. This is very similar type areas Dustin Connell is fishing on Lake Eufaula. It's a brush pile connected to the shoreline or a spawning pocket with a piece of structure, in this case a ditch. Those bass were setting up in that brush pile, staging to spawn. Here's what the spot would look like on a contour line map. The lake I was fishing doesn't have a great contour map for it, but I'm using a spot where I've caught a lot of good fish in the pre-spawn that's very similar. So you can see there's a pocket where the sides of the pocket stick out pretty far and then drop sharply into a creek channel. This forms a ditch, and this is the perfect staging spot for those bass right before they spawn. I found this spot a few months back using the side imaging on my fish finder. On the right side of the screen, you can clearly see the ditch and the cove. The black space on the right side is actually the shoreline, and then where the colored sections start is the bottom of the lake. Out in the center of the screen, you can clearly see the brush pile where those fish were setting up. I didn't graph this spot before I started fishing it because I already knew the brush pile was there, and I knew that it was in shallow water. My rule of thumb is if those brush piles are in less than 8 feet of water, I don't like to graph over them because I fear that it's going to spook the fish. Instead, I use my forward-facing sonar, my Garmin Live Scope, to scan the brush pile to see if there were any fish around the brush. I was actually able to see some fish in the brush, and on my first cast, I saw several fish following my jerkbait out of the brush pile. This is what Dustin Connell was doing at Lake Eufaula, using his Lowrance active target to scan the brush piles and watch the fish follow his bait back to the boat. On my second cast, I was able to put that bait a little bit closer to the brush and actually didn't even see the fish eat it because it bit the bait right as it got close to that brush. However, you can see me actually reeling in the fish on live scope as I'm fighting it back to the boat. Really quick, guys, I want to let you know about some seminars we're offering on our website, fishthemoment.com. Just head to the website and go to the virtual seminars page. Here you'll find 2 new seminars. The first is an advanced spring jig fishing seminar. Randy and I will be giving away our best jig fishing secrets for the pre-spawn, spawn, and post-spawn. If you've ever struggled to catch bass on a jig, this is the seminar for you. Randy and I will be breaking down the best patterns, both offshore and shallow, and the spring is the best time to catch bass on a jig. So if you want to learn, definitely sign up for this seminar. We also just added a new advanced electronics seminar. I've given this seminar several times in the past and it's a fan favorite. If you want to learn about how to maximize your fish finder to find bass offshore, this is the seminar for you. I give up all the juice that I don't talk about in my YouTube videos, including how to decide when to fish a spot based on what you see on your fish finder, how to choose the correct bait to throw based on what's on the screen, and how to find hidden fish that you would not be able to identify without the tips in this seminar. Definitely check out both these seminars over on our website, fishthemoment.com. Now, some of you guys are probably disappointed and think that you need forward-facing sonar to make this pattern work. However, that is definitely not true, and I've been catching fish on this pattern for over 10 years without forward-facing sonar. What I've found is that you actually only need forward-facing sonar about 25% of the time to make this pattern work. 75% of the time, you can use the old waypoint method, where you basically graph the brush pile with your side imaging, mark it, drive back over it with down imaging, see if there's fish in the brush pile, and then cast at your waypoint and get those fish to bite. Now, if that brush pile is really shallow, you might want to graph over it and let it rest for an hour or two before returning to fish it. But as long as that waypoint's there, you can hit that brush pile. And if the conditions are stable, or you have some pre-front conditions with some wind or some cloud cover, usually those fish will be pretty aggressive and they'll bite pretty much any bait you throw in there. A big football jig, a spinnerbait, a deep diving crankbait. However, 25% of the time, those bass can get extremely tricky to catch out of brush piles. And that's when you have post-front conditions and bright bluebird skies with no wind. These are the conditions where those fish get really inactive and you have to basically force them to bite your bait. These are the conditions that the Major League Fishing anglers faced during the last couple days of the Red Crest event. And that's why the jerkbait was so dominant. The jerkbait is a great bait because it suspends in the water and you can actually stop it and let it sit in front of the fish's face. You can then twitch your bait up or down and change your retrieve as well as change the bait's color and depth to trigger a lot of fish to bite. This is a lot more difficult to do with your traditional moving baits like a spinnerbait or a crankbait because those baits will either sink or float. However, that suspending jerkbait can basically just sit right in front of those fish's face and antagonize them long enough until they decide to bite. Combine that with forward-facing sonar and you can actually watch those fish follow your bait, judge their mood and their attitude, and adjust your cadence and retrieve to get those fish to bite. I actually noticed this while I was on the lake and I was fishing on a post-front day with no wind and bright bluebird skies. I tried throwing a lot of different baits, including jigs and crankbaits through the brush piles, just to experiment with this theory, and the only way I could get these fish to bite was by watching them with the forward-facing sonar and throwing a jerkbait over those brush piles. It took a while to get my retrieve and bait selection dialed in, but once it all clicked, I was able to put some really good fish in the boat. I even lost a giant that was bigger than the first fish I caught. I think it was anywhere from maybe 8 to 10 pounds. The lake I was fishing was a hot water lake and had some really big fish in it, and it pulled me straight down to a brush pile and broke me off. And it was really cool to experiment with this new technique because I never throw jerkbaits around brush piles. I'm a big jig fisherman, a crankbait fisherman, and it really opened my eyes to the potential of these baits. However, there are a lot of nuances to it, so I want to explain the specific baits I was using as well as the retrieves I was using to trigger these fish with the live scope.
Next, let's talk about different jerkbaits you can throw with this pattern. Dustin Connell won that Major League Fishing Tour event using a Strike King KVD deep diving jerkbait. I'm not sure if that was the only bait he was throwing, but it was the one I saw in most of the pictures. It's a medium to deep diving jerkbait that goes anywhere from 5 to 8 feet deep. There are a lot of other baits on the market, and the one I was starting the day with today was a Megabass Vision 110 +1 in the deadly black shad color. You can also throw a shadow wrap, you can throw the Loco Special by 13 Fishing. There's a bunch of different deep diving jerkbaits. My preferred jerkbait is always the Vision 110. I've just been throwing it forever, and so I have a lot of confidence in it. And for whatever reason today in the morning, I got a lot more bites when I was throwing this deeper diving jerkbait. However, as the day progressed for me, I started getting a few more bites throwing a shallower diving jerkbait, the regular Vision 110. This is in the clear Laker color. And I actually lost a huge fish like I talked about earlier, and it broke me off and I lost one of these jerkbaits, which is kind of a bummer because they're not cheap. But for whatever reason, as that sun got up and the water temperature warmed up, I had to go to a little bit shallower diving jerkbait to get more bites. And then as the sun popped out, I really couldn't get any bites on these bigger Vision 110 size jerkbaits, either the +1 or the standard. So I started experimenting with pretty much every jerkbait I could find. I was pulling them all in my box, and I finally landed on a super old jerkbait that I've had in my tackle box for 15 years. This is the Megabass Trick Darter 80 jerkbait. It's an 80mm jerkbait. It's really small and it gets a ton of bites. This is actually the first jerkbait that I ever got, and it was recommended to me by Randy when I was 12 years old. So Randy came in clutch 15 years later with this jerkbait recommendation, and it's been catching fish for me for a long time. And it just seemed like the fish wanted a smaller profile bait once the sun got up and it slicked off. You probably catch them on a variety of other jerkbaits as well. That's just what I ended up getting a few extra bites on later in the day. I did throw a few other jerkbait brands. I threw a Smithwick Perfect 10 Rogue along with just a standard Rogue. I basically tried every single jerkbait in the tackle box trying to get these fish to react to the bait, and it's really tricky to actually get these fish to commit to these jerkbaits in certain conditions, especially when you have these bright bluebird skies. So changing up the jerkbait as well as changing up your jerkbait color can be really effective. Like I went over to the Pro Blue color and got one extra bite on it today, going from the deadly black shad to the more translucent color, and that got me a few bites as well. So when you're fishing around these brush piles and you see those fish chasing your bait on live scope, make sure you're adjusting your colors, the size of the bait, and the depth of the bait, get as many bites as possible. One thing I heard Dustin Connell talk about a lot when he was fishing his jerk baits over brush piles is how important the cadence was. I'm fishing a brush pile right here. I actually got a few bites earlier, and I'm seeing fish on the live scope. They're down there and they're following the bait, but for whatever reason, they're not actually eating it. And when you're actually watching these fish follow the bait on live scope, you can see that certain retrieves and certain twitches of the bait can cause them to react better or worse. For example, one thing I saw Dustin do a lot during the tournament was he was jerking his rod up. And that seemed to trigger a lot of bites when he was actually working the bait up as opposed to jerking it down. A lot of guys will point their rod towards the water and work it like this, but he was actually working it up. And that's something I do a lot actually when I'm just fishing jerk baits normally, is give it a few jerks upwards every once in a while, and that can trigger a few bites. Now you don't want to do it over and over again, so you kind of have to mix it up. Sometimes you might just want to pull the bait as opposed to just popping it, and then sometimes you get hung in the brush, so you have to hit your bait. But hopefully that makes sense. I'm gonna get this 110 out of this brush pile hopefully, and try to get a few more bites. Don't worry, we got it out.
After putting all these factors together, I started getting a lot of bites from both smaller fish and bigger fish. The biggest challenge, honestly, was just finding enough brush piles to fish. I only had 10 or 12 brush piles found on this lake before I went out, and for whatever reason, I would only catch one fish per brush pile, and I wasn't able to refish the brush piles again with a jerkbait and get bit. However, while I was watching the Major League Fishing tournament, I did see Dustin Connell catch one fish on a shaky head. And that's something that I love throwing around brush piles, so I tied one on and started rerunning the same brush piles that I got bit out of earlier in the day. Let's see what happens.
Got him. Oh my gosh, there he is. Big one. Oh man. Came back to a brush pile where I broke off a big one earlier on a jerkbait, and these fish just stopped eating the jerkbait, so I had to find another way to get him to bite. There's actually fish chasing this one too. There's another big one with it. Oh, there's 2 or 3 big ones with it. Oh my gosh. There we go. Oh yes. Came back, picked up a little shaky head worm. When the fishing gets tough in these brush piles, you have to switch it up sometimes. I went to a little 7-inch zoom trick worm on a jewel squirrel head, shaky head, and boom, put another really solid fish in the boat. Can't get caught up on just fishing one bait and one pattern. You can see that a lot happening, guys, to even the top pros in the world. They get stuck on one bait or one approach. But whenever you're fishing offshore or any spot and you know there's fish there, change it up, go to a slightly different approach with your bait, your tackle, something like that, and it can put a lot of good fish in the boat. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and learned something about how to fish these pre-spawn bass in brush piles. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to check out more videos from Fish the Moment. Leave a like down below, and I'll see you on the next video. Awesome.